Good evening. Welcome back to the channel, Wealth in Black Spaces. That's health, wealth, and wisdom in black spaces. I'm your host, Tim Alexander. And today I want to talk about a book I'm currently reading. And I just want to talk about the first chapter. I think the first chapter is awesome. Black Wealth Barriers. Black Wellness Barriers. I'm sorry. Black Wellness Barriers is by Dr. Tawana Houston, or you can say Houston. She is a licensed neuropathic physician, cultural wellness educator, and founder of Black Cell Consulting. She has spent well over 2 decades empowering African American communities through holistic wellness practices, social service programs, and culturally affirming wellness initiatives with a background that bridges clinical science, social theory, and spiritual care. She brings a uniquely qualified voice to the conversation on Black health. So this is a segment about health. That's one of the pillars of Black wealth health. But this book is called Black Wellness Barriers by Dr. Tawana Houston. So here we go. Chapter 1. I thought was just fascinating. I'm just going to read a couple of pages. It's not that long, but it talks about, the title of this chapter is talking about the myth of inferiority, the origin story. How did we get to where we at, where some blacks even think they're inferior? That's been ingrained in us since the founding of this country, which can be further from the truth. So here's the origin story, and she pulled a lot of information from other books and kind of synthesizes how did we get to this, how did this myth become so ingrained in America? Because it was codified. For one thing, it was that word codified, look it up, it means it was codified into the Constitution, into the very being of America. And so, but we're here to slowly by slowly, we're going to dispel it, for one thing, and we're going to stop thinking that myth. So the myth of inferiority, the origin story. So here we go. To grapple with the concept of African American experiencing barriers to wellness, one must first understand the power of the narrative of biological inferiority. This living, breathing, moving concept became the primary driver behind a growing nation's acceptance of the dehumanization of enslaved Africans then, and enslaved Africans then, and complicity in the impact it has on its descendants now. Like where we at now. The American institution of slavery was more than an economic enterprise. It was a system. That word, that's systems, that relied on deeply entrenched ideological constructs to maintain its operation. By the 19th century, slavery was an estimated $3.5 billion industry, 3.5 billion, equating to approximately 23 trillion today. 23 trillion. Think about that. That's free labor. That what made America great. That free labor. In today's terms, 23 trillion. To sustain such a profitable system, it was essential for American society to believe that people of African descent were inherently suited to bondage and labor. This belief helped to define black individuals as biologically and morally inferior, and a narrative that bolstered social acceptance of slavery and prevented challenges to its legitimacy. Without this pervasive belief, maintaining a system that deprived millions of people of their basic human rights would have been politically and morally unsustainable. That is the power of dehumanization. It tricks people into accepting behavior that would otherwise immediately recognize as unethical and unfair. Thus, a mythology of black inferiority was created and promoted, painting people of African descent as less than human and emphasizing their natural fitness for servitude. So let me stop right there. All that they did, that it was by design, but yet and still we still survived. Social consensus as the concept of biological inferiority not only contradicts a natural tendency toward human compassion and allyship, but also produces distinctions strong enough to justify barriers, but also produces distinctions strongly enough to justify barriers. These barriers determine who is on the side of access to resources, rights, and privileges, and who is underserving. Society at large accepted this ideology around white supremacy and black inferiority. Therefore, as American society was emerging in its earliest form, black inferiority was melded into its core like an egg into a fully baked cake. Whew. Regardless of the size of the slice or whether or not it has frosting, the concept of racial discrimination is inescapable. The only way to make the cake vegan, or in this case more equitable and just for everyone to consume it without problem, is to bake a new cake. If only rebuilding a nation without racial discrimination were as easy as baking a cake, until there is a collective reckoning, meaning remember what happened and reckon with what happened, with the historical abuses built from the aforementioned falsehoods and deliberate effort to dismantle the structures they have created, black individuals will continue to face barriers in achieving optimal health and well-being, making them more vulnerable to disease prevalence. So here we go. Rebellion and control, the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion. Bacon's rebellion was, I didn't realize how, you learn about Bacon's rebellion, they glean over it. But if you go back and do your learn American history, Bacon's rebellion was pretty significant. So Bacon's rebellion of 1676 marked a critical turning point in the establishment of racial divisions within colonial America. Check this out. This uprising, led by Nathaniel Bacon, brought together European and African laborers, both indentured and enslaved, who shared a common desire to challenge the colonial government's disregard for their grievances. Despite their differing origins, these disenfranchised groups united in resistance against oppressive labor conditions. Now think about that. So you have indentured and enslaved people of European and African descent, but they were striving together for the same cause. So despite their differing origins, these disenfranchised groups united in resistance against oppressive labor conditions. Sound familiar? The monopoly of land by the elite and the lack of government protection. As historian Ibram X. Kendi observes, this rebellion represented a direct threat to Virginia land owners. Okay? For them, it meant that poor whites had to be forever separated from enslaved blacks. Let me read that again. So the Virginia landowners, the elites, they recognized that poor whites and poor blacks getting together to change things is a bad thing. So poor whites had to be forever separated from enslaved blacks. This is history. Now, this is not you can read this stuff. In response, the colonial government acted decisively, instituting measures that would sever such cross-racial alliances and solidify a racial hierarchy that privileged whiteness even among economically disadvantaged Europeans. Prior to the rebellion, European indentured servants and enslaved Africans frequently interacted, working side by side and building bonds based on a shared oppression. This commingling threatened the colonial elite. That togetherness, it threatened them, who feared that a united lower class could overthrow the existing power structures. Following the rebellion's suppression, colonial authorities implemented a strategy designed to divide and conquer the laboring class by embedding racial distinctions into the legal and social fabric of the colony. Jacqueline Ballora, in her book Birth of a Nation, points out how these changes altered those relationships of mutuality, cooperation, and trust between persons of African and European ancestry. Gaining patriarchal allies among poor Europeans was strategic and deliberate. As historian Edmund Morgan suggests, poor whites received a fictive elevation of status, rooted solely in their racial identity rather than any genuine economic improvement. This hollow elevation replaced the promise of land, promise of land or wealth with a socially constructed privilege based on whiteness, which became the basis of a new social hierarchy. So they didn't give them anything from what I'm reading here, although they did get free land. As historian Edmund Morgan said, the poor whites received a fictive elevation of status. So they got an elevation of status without getting anything in return. The elites still became the elites, maintained their power. The colonial government moved swiftly to enforce such racial divisions through an array of legal measures and social controls, which served both to strip people of African descent of rights and to indoctrinate poor, landless whites with a sense of racial superiority. So they got indoctrinated with superiority, which goes on to this day. Laws were enacted that restricted the full participation of black people in society. They were banned from holding property or weapons, and their mobility within the colony was curtailed. These measures placed black bodies under constant surveillance and subjected them to brutal enforcement mechanisms such as slave patrols, which ironically became, initially limited to slave holders. Slave patrol duty soon became compulsory for all white men, even those without property. This imbued white society with a sense of power and authority and was grounded solely on race. Embedding a culture of racial policing into the daily lives of white citizens, poor whites who might otherwise have aligned with African laborers based on economic interests were encouraged instead to view themselves as protectors of the racial order, responsible for policing the activities and movements of black individuals. Kende, the writer, refers to the poor whites' new role as the armed defenders of planters, a place that was so bitter animosity between them and enslaved Africans. So this was their way of not having another Bacon's Rebellion. The creation of legally enforced racial hierarchy ultimately reshaped Virginia's social landscape. As Ballora points out, white laborers were given little more than authority. So they're given the authority to rule over their fellow laborers of African descent and members of native tribes on the premise that they share a superior status with the elites, whiteness. Okay? This sense of racial unity provided poor whites with a psychological sense of empowerment as the continuous stripping away of African rights affirmed their place above black individuals within the social hierarchy. The elite successfully restructured Virginia society, binding poor whites to a racial identity that offered no material benefit but promised a sense of superiority over African Americans. The manufactured solidarity, rooted in whiteness, obscured the economic realities of poverty, creating a society that will remain divided along racial lines rather than uniting against the true sources of economic oppression. Economic, social, and political fears appear very real in the eyes of the beholder, making them ripe for the governmental control via manipulation. The aftermath of Bacon's rebellion is only one example among others where the government manipulates false evidence to appear real. Fear spells out fear as part of a strategy to maintain power. The use of skin tone to pit whites against blacks simplified undeniable distinctions between the two groups. Colonial Americans used skin tone to create identities through which to employ their divide and conquer strategy. One of the oldest books in the arsenal is Divide and Conquer. What happens when two ethnic groups have an equivalent amount of melanin concentration, sharing the genetics, culture, and linguistics, such as the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda? Their social stratification was class-based. Hutus could work towards elevation of status, become chiefs, and evolve into Tutsis. The Tutsis. This made ethnicity a fluid concept for them. That is until the Belgian government came along and changed the narrative, paving a path towards the treachery of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Just giving an example. That left hundreds of thousands of people brutally massacred over the course of 100 days. Talking about the Rwandan massacre. So it talks about that a little bit. Okay. So both situations, the Rwandan genocide and the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion, demonstrate how colonial authorities fostered a racialized social order to manipulate social divisions and maintain their grip on power. The harrowing details of the Rwandan genocide serve to ground us in the reality of the dangerous nature of racialized or ethnicity-based dehumanization. Many Americans take our racialized system for granted, a status quo perhaps, but are more easily able to recognize similar systems as horrific when decontextualized from their own tradition of a racialized society. Okay. In the American case, finish this up. In the American case, black individuals were systematically excluded from the emerging narrative of American identity, positioned instead as a permanent underclass whose humanity was continuously denied. The long-term consequences of these practices created a dual narrative, one of privilege and belonging as whiteness, and one of perpetual struggle and exclusion as blackness. For the dominant culture, the arising American identity became one of freedom, opportunity, and advancement. You ever heard that saying, free black in 21? Free white in 21? Now you know the origin of that. Free white in 21. They used to say it a lot in old black and white films. The long-term consequence, perpetual struggle, exclusion as black. For the dominant culture, a rising American identity became one of freedom, opportunity, and advancement, but black individuals became experience defined by oppression, dispossession, and survival. The colonial government's plan was so brilliantly executed that for hundreds of years, the social hierarchy, understanding, and acceptance remained in place and have not been challenged. Unfortunately, this social reality created profound psychological impacts on the black community. Generations of African Americans have internalized, and we have internalized this myth. This internalized the experience of being treated as other, as society develops more sophisticated mechanisms to suppress both their senses and freedom of self-worth. And I'll give you a quick example of this. I seen this firsthand. I was in McDonald's one time. Matter of fact, in Atlanta, the so-called Black Mecca. When I say so-called, because we don't own a lot of buildings. Do your research. I was in the McDonald's, had stopped, got me some, and let me paint the scene here. When you look back in who was cooking, who was at the cashier, it was all black. It was not one white person behind in that cashier back there. And this black guy beside me, I guess they were taking too long. He turned to me in a joking way and said, "You know what's wrong?" I said, "No, what's wrong?" He's like, "Ain't no white person back there. If it was a white person managing them, they'll be getting this stuff out just like that." Shocking, but not shocking that a black person would say something like that, because you see, that's an inferiority complex. He basically is stating that because a white person is now back there controlling the situation, them black people can't manage that McDonald's. Horrible thought, ain't it? But this is what some black people think. They don't believe they can do something without the white man or white woman. It's just a sad fact. But we as you know better, you do better. I mean, I'm from Alabama. I've heard elders say, "I ain't taking my car to no black person. I'm taking them to no white man to get it fixed." This is the thinking. If you go back to what Malcolm X said, one of his great speeches, who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught you to hate your nose? And you listen to the speech. This imposed identity, constructed through centuries of legal and social reinforcement, was more than just a societal narrative. It carried with it a severe repercussion on all aspects of black health and well-being. As research continues, let me turn my glasses on here. As research continues to reveal, the chronic stress associated with racism and social inclusion has profound biological and psychological effects, contributing to elevated risks of hypertension, metabolic disorder, and other adverse health outcomes within the black community. Though laws and social practices that alienated black individuals from humanity, through laws and social practices that alienated black individuals from humanity, American society established a system of racial toxicity and its associated barriers that continue to negatively shape both cultural identity and health outcomes today. Like I said, I've seen it firsthand. I've seen self-hating black folk that'll say something like that and truly mean it. Thought leaders of oppression. Laws targeting black Americans were only the beginning of the carefully constructed racial ideology to maintain a relative unchallenged justification of economic, political, and social exploitation of people of African descent and their descendants. Reconditioning social behavior was not enough. There had to be a deep-seated shift in the attitudes and belief system that was unquestionably internalized, fully embraced and embodied by their masses as the inherent truth. This indoctrination of a narrative of biological inferiority would not only become easy for white social acceptance, but it would also become a nearly inescapable message permeating the consciousness of many of the enslaved Africans and their descendants. The high rollers of social influence used their rank as intellectuals, physicians, scientists, and other public figures to propagate widely disseminate the false narrative of black inferiority. These influencers leveraged both their position and platforms to give credible voice to their unsubstantiated ideology. As noted by historian Harriet Washington in Medical Apartheid, another good book I got, the scientific racist emphasis was not upon fact-based theories, logical methodologies, experimental data, control groups, and verification by replication. By embedding these ideas into the emerging fields of medicine, anthropology, and biology, they provided the so-called scientific evidence needed to justify slavery, systemic racism, and the exclusion of African Americans from the full rights of citizenship. This scientific evidence gave elite society a pseudo-rational basis for regarding black people as naturally inferior, reinforcing a social order that benefited from the continued exploitation of black bodies from the cradle to the grave. Kind of like the prison, from school to prison pipeline that's still going on today. So you had slavery, and then you had somewhat of a reconstruction that wasn't a reconstruction, and then you have the you can how they put it in the Constitution, where you can basically you can be a slave except by doing a crime. So what they do, they start criminalizing you for vagrancy, and then they put you right back in slavery. Except now, no, okay. These ideologies continue to influence racial disparities and biases today, perpetuating sustained barriers in all aspects of life for many African Americans. These barriers that led to poor health outcomes came from the historical and contemporary navigation of what it means on a cellular level to live in a systematically oppressive environment. So she goes on to highlight 5 primary architects of the false narrative to examine how the nihilism around black wellness first came about. She talks about Charles Caldwell, 1772 to 1853. He was a physician and promoter of phrenology. He promoted the belief that black people were physically different in ways that suited them for manual labor in hot climates. He was a teacher at Transylvania University, what is now known as University of Louisville. He influenced generations of physicians on theories that were not fringe beliefs. They became part of the mainstream media, basically saying, we have a high capacity for pain and all that stuff. That came from Caldwell, and that still perpetuates hospitals to this day. Placing us Samuel Cartwright, 1793 to 1868. He was a physician and proponent of scientific racism. He was one of the most notorious figures in the history of American medical racism. His work exemplified how pseudoscience was used to legitimize slavery and reinforce the belief that of black inferiority, embedding racial ideologies into the foundation of American medicine. He referred to his thing as black diseases, where he pathologized the behavior of enslaved blacks. Most notably, he coined the condition drapetomania in 1851, which he describes as a mental illness that caused enslaved people to flee captivity. Think of that. These are medical doctors. This guy that came up with something called drapetomania, that a human being has a disease because he want to be free. Drapetomania. You got Samuel Morton, founder of craniometry. He collected human skulls and stuff, kind of that stuff. You ever seen Django when he was sitting there at the table talking about that cranium and about that cranium and stuff? That stuff is based on that narrative was based on a real person. And that was George Morton that talked about that stuff, like that our cranials were different. And he aligned it with white superiority. So yeah, this is I encourage you. Like I said, I always encourage you to keep reading. Like I say, the person that what's his name, Marcus Garvey, said you ought to be reading at least 4 hours a day. I know we can't. We have working lives. You can't read 4 hours a day, but you can get you at least 30 minutes in reading. You need to be reading books like this. Elevating your mind, understand, because if you don't know the past, you're bound to repeat it, the saying goes. So I just want to talk about that, black wellness barriers, and the book goes on and how, and it talks about, how can we prevention, taking charge before preventing measures, staying ahead, and neuropathic doctors, and talks about the epigenetics. Our epigenetics have been changed because of slavery. In slavery, um, some of the survival mechanism we use even to this day is based on some things that our ancestors, we don't even realize it, but it's in our genes were literally changed because of slavery. So we have to uncover this thing and get out of the pettiness. And I'm talking to myself also, and really join book clubs, create book clubs, and not only need to be reading this type of stuff, you need to be investment books, things that are gonna take you to the next level as far as stacking your knowledge. You should always be stacking your knowledge every year, whether it's certifications, learning a new skill, stacking those skills. As you stack your skills, stack your wealth. Uh, I seen a podcast they was talking about how we'll rather look wealthy than to be wealthy, and that's true. We want to keep up with the Joneses, but you're basically wearing your wealth, the gold chains and stuff like that, and it makes no sense. We got to stack our wealth. We got to um, be putting our wealth in investment vehicles, and we got to be passing that wealth on because we all leaving here. You got to have a plan, put trust together, wheels together, buy some land instead of buying that brand new car. Buy you some lots, build one for your house, and then put one up for rent or flip it, and then get flip two and then keep one. Just different things. But just have the wealth mindset, thinking long term. But that's all I got to say. I just want to read this book, Black Wellness Barriers by Dr. Tawana Houston. I love you. See you next time.